Medellin get more attention than it deserves? Hi all, I'm Ezrado and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. Today I wanted to expand on something that I've mentioned briefly in a couple of my previous videos, and that's about the popularity of Medellin. I'm sure a lot of you who probably watch a lot of Colombian content in addition to my own may have heard people talk a lot about this city. From its idyllic title of the City of Eternal Spring to the unending praise of El Poblado en Laureles, to the adoration of the hip metropolitan paisa culture, the vibrant nightlife and the infrastructure, you might conclude that it's nothing short of an Elysian utopia. In more recent years though, you'll notice that some criticisms have been slowly creeping into the conversation. Now, I'll give you my 2 cents on this city towards the end of the video, but really I wanted to talk about a cultural phenomenon I've noticed in regards to trends, which I think can explain a lot about the rise and potential fall in popularity of Medellin. See, there's a pattern I've noticed with a lot of things that become popular, particularly pop culture like movies, games, music, and TV series, but also with things related to travel and experiences like cities and restaurants. With many popular things, I've observed that there's often a common thread, and that's the fact that they started out as unassuming. Let's take a popular movie for example, say Parasite, and look at how that rose in popularity throughout the world. Bear with me, I promise this will wrap back around to Medellin eventually. Okay, so Parasite. First of all, it's a Korean movie. Now, when you go to the theatre, historically, the big new release movies that you see advertised everywhere are usually from Hollywood or the US somewhere. Films from elsewhere can be shown internationally as well, but usually they aren't the big worldwide ticket sellers, as a lot of people have just sort of become used to the familiarity of Hollywood. Now, I'm not saying that's right or justified in any way. I mean, I personally believe good movies come from everywhere. I'm just saying that this is the way it's historically been. So then you have this movie come along that's a quote-unquote foreign film, and as such, it doesn't get this immediate mainstream attention, but instead just a small number of people go to see it to begin with. What happens next though really illustrates the crux of my point. See, I think we as people have this innate desire to discover things. More specifically, there's a joy of discovering something of great value after looking somewhere that's inconspicuous to us, as this makes the discovery a surprise. The problem is though, the joy of this unexpected discovery can cloud your judgment over its value. You found this thing completely randomly, so you weren't going in with expectations, but then suddenly it takes you by surprise, and the joy you got out of that surprise, out of that discovery, contributed to your overall positive reception, skewing your judgment to be more favourable. So when a few people stumbled upon a foreign film that to begin with wasn't being hyped up in many places and discovered something good, there was like this innate urge to be like, wow, this is the best thing since sliced bread, and then the hype spread from there. Now, was it good? Sure, I'd give it like an 8 out of 10, but was it the best movie in the history of cinema good, as the movie review app Letterboxd would have you believe? Well, I wouldn't go that far. Still, a lot of people were arguably dispositioned to praise it extra generously, being intoxicated by the hype of randomly stumbling upon something of value. And all of that is to say that this is what I think happened with Medellin. First of all, it's a city of Colombia, which is a country that was seen by many as a no-go zone throughout the 80s and 90s due to the drug violence. Moreover, Medellin specifically was like the epicenter of this unrest, since Escobar's operation was specifically the Medellin cartel. So already you have a city here that people certainly aren't considering as a holiday destination or a place to live. In fact, contrary to Parasite, people aren't even coming from a neutral position on it, as from the get-go it's positioned as a dangerous crime-ridden city. Now that might seem like a disadvantage, but there is a silver lining here, and that is that any good to come out of the city will now be seen by foreigners as a pleasant surprise. Unlike a city such as, I don't know, Paris, where the reputation is set so high from the get-go that there's little room for people's expectations to be exceeded, Medellin had nowhere to go but up, and that's exactly what happened. As the drug war situation improved, the dust began to settle, and in the following decades, relative peace was brought to Medellin, allowing it to breathe and become a very livable city. Foreigners were so transfixed on it as this crime-ridden no-man's land that when it transformed itself into anything resembling a habitable city, it came as a great shock. And then the word got out about it as people realised that it wasn't only livable but also full of vibrant culture and was an absolute haven for digital nomads. That right there was a huge surprise. I mean, here you have a city that was home to the biggest drug kingpin in the world and his cartel, plagued by constant acts of grand-scale terrorism, but wow, now it's this cool, vibey city that just feels made for expats. And I think the excitement that came with this revelation spurred a lot of people to hype it up as something more than it was. In reality, yeah, it's a fine livable city with a respectable nightlife, vibrant culture and great weather, but is it the best city in all of Latin America or one of the top 5 cities in the world? Well, that's subjective, but I would argue no. There are a lot of great cities that have all of these things and maybe even have them better, but those cities don't get the constant hype because unlike Medellin, it's not a novelty for them to be good. It's just kind of taken for granted as something to be expected. Medellin, on the other hand, started from a place of being unassuming, and so now it's not just a good city, it's a good city that caught me off guard, and so oh my gosh, now it's amazing. Again, the hype that comes with the surprise contributes heavily to the positive reception, to the point of exaggerating even to yourself about it. So I think you get the idea of what I'm trying to say here. Basically, this is where I think Medellin has been at, particularly over the last decade, as more and more foreigners have discovered it. Of course, I mentioned at the start though, that in recent times I've seen some more criticism over the city seep in, and this is really the next stage of the trend that I wanted to talk about. The downfall. Now, going back to my analogy, when it came to Parasite, this had an inherent benefit, and that was that, as a movie, it had a limited shelf life. What I mean by that is that it had its moment in the sun when it was released in theaters and made a buzz around the internet for a while after, but in a world of short attention spans, a lot of people just see it once, maybe a few times, and then move on to the next thing they want to watch. But this is totally normal for any movie, as people don't expect movies to forever hold the same level of cultural attention and fanfare as they had when they were initially released. And so when a movie stops getting all this attention and people stop watching it and thinking about it, it just becomes eternalized as a positive memory rather than being subject to the same level of scrutiny it received upon release. When it comes to cities, on the other hand, this isn't the case. A city can't just fade into obscurity as a memory, at least not on a societal level. Instead, cities need to hold your attention for as long as they possibly can if they want to achieve their ultimate goal of having you live there permanently. In other words, they need to take an evergreen approach, which puts them at a disadvantage, because what can often happen with things that need to maintain long-term interest is that, well, they can't. An analogy I'd use for this would be a washed-up music artist. I'm sure this is a concept we're all familiar with, so I probably don't need to explain it as much, but you know when you see an artist who starts out as really creative and fresh and maybe independent and underground, or at least not too popular, but then becomes super mainstream and their music becomes very commercial and a little soulless. And then at that point, people become disillusioned with the artist because they're just not as fresh and exciting as they were when they were new on the scene. And even if they are, they're just so incredibly mainstream that people become really hipsterish about it and just stop listening to them. Well, hey, this is pretty much what's happening with Marvel, so I guess I could still use movies in this analogy, albeit at the level of the franchise. Anyway, point is, this is what I think is happening with Medellin now. Maybe not on a grand scale, but I have seen a few people slowly start to critique Medellin for the first time ever, something I really couldn't imagine just a couple of years ago even. So why is this happening? Well, similar to the analogy I just gave, I reckon there are a couple of key factors. First of all, I think when something has been popular for a while, it loses its freshness. In other words, fewer people are getting that surprise element from discovering something unassuming or randomly stumbling upon it, because, well, it's no longer unassuming. In fact, it's the complete opposite. And this is really what's been happening with Medellin over the last few years. It used to be new to a lot of foreigners and a best kept secret, but now the word's been out for a while, it's become one of the most hyped up cities in all of Latin America. Now, why is this an issue? Well, as I described earlier, I think that surprise element can really skew people's judgments towards being more favourable. It's like looking at something through rose-tinted glasses. So when you take that surprise element away, it's like taking off those glasses and seeing the thing for what it really is. Now, that's not to say that Medellin in reality is some dumpster fire. Like, I actually think it's a decent city, but what I'm trying to say is that when you take away that cognitive bias, your perception of it mightn't be as emphatically enthusiastic since you're looking at it differently now. The other key factor as to why I think people are beginning to critique Medellin more has to do with another disadvantage that cities in general have compared to most other things, and that is that if they become popular, this actually has a palpable effect on them. Unlike, say, a movie where you could watch it and be totally ignorant as to how popular it is, in a city, this directly affects how many people there are, and specifically how many expats and tourists there are. Now, it's one thing to become fatigued from hearing about a city incessantly, but it's another thing to actually feel the effect of this popularity. I know I mentioned in my Defense of Cartagena video that I don't think tourists should be a deterrent for you if you're visiting somewhere, but if you're actually looking for somewhere to live, this I think is a very reasonable thing to consider, as a lot of us are moving to Colombia because we want an authentic Colombian experience. We didn't come here to see tourists and expats from home or similar countries. In fact, a lot of us came to get away from that. With that being said, I wouldn't go as far as saying Medellin's reached a breaking point on this yet. If you live in Laureles or El Poblado, then yeah, I can definitely see this being an issue, but in a lot of the more middle-class neighborhoods that people seem to overlook, you could definitely feel like you're the only foreigner around. This brings me to my personal opinion on Medellin though, as to be honest, I think there's a large gap in how relaxing and, let's say, aesthetically pleasing the neighborhoods are between the high class areas and middle class areas, and this disparity is arguably more present here than it is in many other Colombian cities. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of pleasant middle class neighborhoods, but the kind of brouhaha you hear about Medellin online, I think tends to be more applicable to the higher class areas. When I visited the city for the first time, for instance, I actually spent most of my time in the middle class neighborhoods, and after that experience, I honestly came away with the impression that Medellin was heavily overrated. In the areas I spent my time, there was way more noticeable population density than any other city I'd been. It was noisier than any other city I'd been, yes, even compared to the coastal cities, and the buildings are extremely homogenized in that so many have this same red brick look, which is fine if you're just visiting, but might become a little tiresome if you're living there long term. When I visited a second time though, I had a chance to visit some of the wealthier suburbs, and suddenly my opinion changed quite a bit, as everything I just mentioned really isn't as applicable to these areas. So if you're someone who's chosen to make your world small and just spend your time in these areas, then yeah, I can see why you'd like Medellin a lot, but then that brings me back to what I was saying before about how most of these neighborhoods have become full of expats, and so now you have that to contend with. Again, I just want to disclaim that regardless of whether you're in a high class or middle class area, I don't think any of these quote-unquote issues should matter if you're just visiting. These are really things that hold more weight if you're choosing to live there. To that end, whilst I personally wouldn't put Medellin super high on my list of places to live, I still definitely recommend it a visit, as I think there's a lot of great culture to check out, and you may as well see what all the hype's about and form an impression of your own. Anyway, that's enough for today, but let me know in the comments what you think of Medellin, if you've been or if you've lived there, or if you're planning to go. We'd love to hear what you have to say. As always, thanks for watching so far, and if you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao!